Hello, sisters. Right Wing Women by Andrea Dworkin, published in 1983. Acknowledgements. Many people went out of their way to help me in different ways in the course of my writing this book. I owe sincere thanks to Jerry Toma, Anne Simon, Robin Morgan, Catherine A. McKinnon, Karen Hornick, Emily Jane Goodman, Rachel Gold, Sandra Elkin, Laura Cottenham, Jenna Corina, and Raymond Bongiovanni. I am very grateful to Sam Mitnick for supporting this project and to all the people at Perigee who involved in publishing it. This book owes its existence to Gloria Steinem, whose idea it was that I expand on an earlier essay, Safety, Shelter, Rules, Form, Love, The Promise of the Ultra-Right, in Miss June 1979, into a book. I thank Gloria not only for the idea, but also for her insistence on its importance. And I thank once again both John Stoltenberg and Elaine Markson, who sustained me. Andrea Dworkin, New York City, March 1982. For Gloria Steinem, in memory of Muriel Reckheiser. Epigraph. Nothing strengthens the judgment and quickens the conscience like individual responsibility. Nothing adds such dignity to character as the recognition of one's self-sovereignty, the right to an equal place, everywhere conceded, a place earned by personal merit, not an artificial attainment by inheritance. Inheritance, wealth, family, and position. Conceding, then, that the responsibilities of life rest equally on man and woman, that their destiny is the same, they need the same preparation for time and eternity. The talk of sheltering women from the fierce storms of life is the sheerest mockery, for they beat at her from every position of the compass, just as they do on man, and with more fatal results, as he has been trained to protect himself, to resist, and to conquer. Such are the facts in human experience, the responsibilities of individual sovereignty. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, 1892. Chapter 1. The Promise of the Ultra-Right. There is a rumor, circulating for centuries by scientists, artists, and philosophers, both secular and religious, a piece of gossip, as it were, to the effect that women are quote-unquote biologically conservative. While gossip among women is universally ridiculed as low and trivial, gossip among men, especially if it is about women, is called theory or idea or fact. This particular rumor became dignified as high thought because it was whispered down the lane in formidable academies, libraries, and meeting halls from which women, until very recently, had been formally and forcibly excluded. The whispers, however multisyllabic and footnoted they sometimes are, reduced to a simple enough set of assertions. Women have children because women, by definition, have children. This quote unquote fact of life, which is not subject to qualification, carries with it the instinctual obligation to nurture and protect those children. Therefore, women can be expected to be socially, politically, economically, and sexually conservative, because the status quo, whatever it is safer than change, whatever the change. Noxious male philosophers from all disciplines have, for centuries, maintained that women follow a biological imperative derived directly from their reproductive capacities that translates necessarily into narrow lives, small minds, and a rather mean spirited Puritanism. This theory, or slander, is both specious and cruel, in that, in fact, Women are forced to bear children, have been throughout history in all economic systems, with but teeny weeny timeouts, while the men are momentarily disoriented, as, for instance, in the immediate postcoital aftermath of certain revolutions. It is entirely irrational, in fact, in It is entirely irrational in that, in fact, women of all ideological persuasions, with the single exception of absolute pacifists, of whom there have not been many, have throughout history supported wars in which the very children they are biologically ordained to protect are maimed, raped, tortured, and killed. Clearly, the biological explanation of the so called conservative nature of women obscures the realities of women's lives, buries them in dark shadows of distortion and dismissal. The disinterested or hostile male observer can categorize women as quote unquote conservative in some metaphysical sense, because it is true that women, as a class, adhere rather strictly to the to the traditions and values of their social context, whatever the character of that context. In societies of whatever description, however narrowly or broadly defined, women as a class are the dulled conformists, the orthodox believers, the obedient followers, the disciples of unwavering faith. To waver, whatever the creed of the man around them, is tantamount to rebellion. It is dangerous. Most women, holding on for dear life, do not dare abandon blind faith. From father's house to husband's house to a grave that still might not be her own, a woman acquiesces to male authority in order to gain some protection from male violence. She conforms in order to be as safe as she can be. Sometimes it is a lethargic conformity, in which case male demands slowly close in on her as if she were a character buried alive in an Edgar Allan Poe story. Sometimes it is a militant conformity. She will save herself by proving that she is loyal, obedient, useful, even fanatic in the service of the men around her. She is the happy hooker, the happy homemaker, the exemplary Christian, the pure academic, the pure comrade, the terrorist par excellence. Whatever the values, she will embody them with her perfect fidelity. The males rarely keep their part of the bargain as she understands it protection from male violence against her person. But the militant conformists have given so much of herself, her labor, heart, soul, often her body, often children, that this betrayal is akin to nailing the coffin shut. The corpse is beyond caring. Women know, but must not acknowledge, that resisting male control or confronting male betrayal will lead to rape, battery, destitution, ostracization, or exile, confinement in a mental institution or jail, or death. As Phyllis Chesler and Emily Jane Goodman make clear in Women, Money, and Power, women struggle in the manner of Sisyphus, to avoid the quote unquote something worse that can and will always happen to them if they transgress the rigid boundaries of appropriate female behavior. Most women cannot afford, either materially or psychologically, to recognize that whatever burnt offerings of obedience they bring to beg protection will not appease the angry little gods around them. It is not surprising, then, that most girls do not want to become like their mothers, those tired, preoccupied domestic sergeants beset by incomprehensible troubles. Mothers raise daughters to conform to the strictures of the conventional female life as defined by men, whatever the ideological value of the men. Mothers are the immediate enforcers of male will, the guards of the cell door, the flunkies who administer the electric shocks to punish rebellion. Most girls, however much they resent their mothers, do become very much like them. Rebellion can rarely survive the aversion therapy that passes for being brought up female. Male violence acts directly on the girl through her father or brother or uncle or any number of male professionals or strangers, as it did and does on her mother, and she too is forced to learn to conform in order to survive. A girl may, as she enters adulthood, repudiate the particular set of males with whom her mother is allied, run with a different pack, as it were, but she will replicate her mother's patterns in acquiescence to male authority within her own chosen set. Using both force and threat, men in all camps demand that women accept abuse in silence and shame, tie themselves to hearth and home with rope made of self blame, unspoken rage, grief, and resentment. It is the fashion among men to despise the smallness of women's lives. The so called bourgeois woman, with her shallow vanity, for instance, is a joke to the brave intellectuals, truck drivers, and revolutionaries who have wider horizons on which to project and indulge deeper vanities than women dare not mock and to which women dare not aspire. The fishwife is a vicious caricature of the small mindedness and material greed of the working class wife, who harasses her humble, hard working, ever patient husband with petty tirades of insults that no gentle rebuke can mellow. The lady, the aristocrat, is a polished, empty shell, good only for spitting at, because spit shows up on her clean exterior, which gives immediate gratification to the spitter, whatever his technique. The Jewish mother is a monster who wants to cut the phallus of her precious son into a million pieces and put it into chicken soup. The black woman, also a castrator, is a grotesque matriarch whose sheer endurance desolates men. The lesbian is half monster, half moron. Having no man to nag, she imagines herself Napoleon. And the derision of female lives does not stop with these toxic, ugly, insidious slanders, because there is always, in every circumstance, the derision in its skeletal form, all bone, the meat stripped away clean. She is a pussy, cunt. Every other part of her body is cut away, severed, and there is left a thing, not a human, and it, which is the funniest joke of all, an unending source of raucous humor, and those who have done the cutting. The very butchers who cut up the meat and throw away the useless parts are the comedians. The paring down of a whole person to vagina and womb, and then to a dismembered obscenity for their best and favorite joke. Every woman, no matter what her social, economic, or sexual situation, fights this paring down with every resource at her command. Because her resources are so astonishingly meager, and because she has been deprived of the means to organize and expand them, these attempts are simultaneously heroic and pathetic. The whore, in defending the pimp, finds her own worth in the light reflected from his gaudy baubles. The wife, in defending her husband, screams and stammers that her life is not a wasteland of murdered possibilities. The woman, in defending the ideologies of men, who rise by climbing over her prone body in military formation, will not publicly mourn the loss of what those men have taken from her. She will not scream out their heel as their heels dig into her flesh, because to do so would mean the end of meaning itself. All the ideals that motivated her to deny herself would be indelibly stained with blood that she would have to acknowledge at last as her own. So the woman hangs on, not with the delicacy of a clinging vine, but with the tenacity, incredible in its intensity, to the very persons, institutions, and values that demean her, degrade her, glorify her powerlessness, insist upon constraining and paralyzing the most honest expressions of her will and being. She becomes a lackey, serving those who ruthlessly and effectively aggress against her and her kind. This singularly self hating loyalty to those committed to her own destruction is the very essence of womanhood, as men of all ideological persuasions define it. Marilyn Monroe, shortly before she died, wrote in her notebook on the set of Let's Make Love, quote, "What am I afraid of? Why am I so afraid? Do I think I can't act? I know I can act, but I'm afraid. I am afraid and I should not be and I must not be." End quote. The actress is the only female culturally empowered to act. When she acts well, that is, when she convinces the male controllers of images and wealth that she is reductible to current sexual fashion, available to the male on his own terms, she is paid and honored. Her acting must be imitative, not creative, rigidly conforming, not self generated and self renewing. The actress is the puppet of flesh, blood, and paint, who acts as if she is the female acting. Monroe, the consummate sexual doll, is empowered to act, but afraid to act, perhaps because no amount of acting, however inspired, can convince the actor herself that her ideal female life is not a dreadful form of dying. She grinned, she posed, she pretended, she had affairs with famous and powerful men. A friend of hers claimed that she had so many illegal abortions wrongly performed on her reproductive organs that they were severely injured. She died alone, possibly acting on her own behalf for the first time. Death, one imagines, numbs pains that barbiturates and alcohol cannot touch. Monroe's premature death raised one haunting question for the men who were, in their own fantasy, her lovers, for the men who had masturbated over those pictures of exquisite female compliance. Was it possible, could it be, that she hadn't liked it all along? The it they had been doing to her? How many millions of times? Had those smiles been masks covering despair or rage? If so, how endangered had they been to be deceived, so fragile and exposed in their masturbatory delight, as if she could leap out from their photos of what was now a corpse and take the revenge they knew she deserved. There arose the male imperative that Monroe must not be a suicide. Norman Mailer, a savior of masculine privilege and pride on many fronts, took up the challenge by theorizing that Monroe may have been killed by the FBI or CIA or whoever killed the Kennedys, because she had been mistresses to one or both. Conspiracy was a cheerful and comforting thought to those who had wanted to slam into her until she expired, female death and female ecstasy being synonymous in the world of male metaphor. But they did not want her dead yet. Not really dead. Not while the illusion of her open invitation was absolutely compelling. In fact, her lovers in both flesh and fantasy had fucked her to death, and her apparent suicide stood at once an accusation and an answer. No, Marilyn Monroe, the ideal sexual female, had not liked it. People, as we are always reminded by counterfeit egalitarians, have always died too young, too soon, too isolated, too full of insupportable anguish. But only women die one by one, whether famous or obscure, rich or poor, isolated, choked to death by the lies tangled in their throats. Only women die one by one, attempting until the last minute to embody an ideal imposed upon them by men who want to use them up. Only women die one by one, smiling up to the last minute. Smile of the siren, smile of the coy girl, smile of the mad woman. Only women die one by one, polished to perfection or unkempt behind locked doors, too desperately ashamed to cry out. Only women die one by one, still believing that if only they had been perfect, perfect wife, mother, or whore, they would not have come to hate life so much, to find it so strangely difficult and empty, themselves so hopelessly confused and despairing. Women die, mourning not the loss of their own lives, but their own inexcusable inability to achieve perfection as men defined it for them. Women desperately try to embody a male defined feminine ideal because survival depends on it. The ideal, by definition, turns a woman into a function, deprives her of any individuality that is self serving or self created, not useful to the male in his scheme of things. This monstrous female quest for male defined perfection, so intrinsically hostile to freedom and integrity, leads inevitably to bitterness, paralysis, or death. But like the mirage in the desert, the life giving oasis that is not there, survival is promised in this conformity and nowhere else. Like the chameleon, the woman must blend into her environment, never calling attention to the qualities that distinguish her, because to do so would be to attract the predator's deadly attention. She is, in fact, hunted meat. All the male auteurs, scientists, and homespun philosophers on street corners will say so proudly. Attempting to strike a bargain, the woman says, I come to you on your own terms. Her hope is that his murderous attention will focus on a female who conforms less artfully, less willingly. In effect, she ransoms the remains of a life, what is left over after she has renounced willful individuality, by promising indifference to the fate of other women. This sexual, sociological, and spiritual adaptation, which is, in fact, the maiming of all moral capacity, is the primary imperative of survival for women who live under male supremacist rule. Quote, I gradually came to see that I would have to stay within the survivor's own perspective. This will perhaps bother the historian with his distrust of personal evidence, but radical suffering transcends relativity, and when one survivor's account of an event or circumstance is repeated in exactly the same way by dozens of other survivors, men and women in different camps, from different nations and cultures, then one comes to trust the validity of such reports and even to question rare departures from the general view. End quote. Terence Desprez, The Survivor, An Anatomy of Life in the Death Camps. The accounts of rape, wife beating, forced childbearing, medical butchering, sex motivated murder, forced prostitution, physical mutilation, sadistic psychological abuse, and the other commonplaces of female experience that are excavated from the past or given by contemporary survivors should leave the heart seared, the mind in anguish, and the conscience in upheaval. But they do not, no matter how often these stories are told. With whatever clarity or eloquence, bitterness or sorrow, they might as well have been whispered in wind or written in sand. They disappear as if they were nothing. The tellers and the stories are ignored or ridiculed, threatened back into silence or destroyed, and the experience of female suffering is buried in cultural invisibility and contempt. Because women's testimony is not and cannot be validated by the witness of men who have experienced the same events, and given them the same value, the very reality of abuse sustained by women, despite its overwhelming pervasiveness and constancy, is negated. It is negated in the transactions of everyday life, and it is negated in the history books left out, and it is negated by those who claim to care about suffering but are blind to this suffering. The problem, simply stated, is that one must believe in the existence of the person in order to recognize the authenticity of her suffering. Neither men nor women believe in the existence of women as significant beings. It is impossible to remember as real the suffering of someone who, by definition, has no legitimate claim to dignity or freedom, someone who is in fact viewed as something, an object, or an absence. And if a woman, an individual woman multiplied by billions, does not believe in her own discrete existence, and therefore cannot credit authority of her own suffering, she is erased, cancelled out, and the meaning of her life, whatever it is, whatever it might have been, is lost. This loss cannot be calculated or comprehended. It is vast and awful, and nothing will ever make up for it. No one can bear to live a meaningless life. Women fight for meaning just as women fight for survival, by attaching themselves to men and the values honored by men. By committing themselves to male values, women seek to acquire value. By advocating male meaning, women seek to acquire meaning. Subservient to male will, women believe that subservience itself is the meaning of a female life. In this way, women, whatever they suffer, do not suffer the anguish of a conscious recognition that, because they are women, they have been robbed of volition and choice, without which no life can have meaning. The political right in the United States today makes certain metaphysical and material promises to women that both exploit and quiet some of women's deepest fears. These fears originate in the perception that male violence against women is uncontrollable and unpredictable. Dependent on and subservient to men, women are always subjected to this violence. The right promises to put enforceable restraints on male aggression, thus simplifying survival for women, to make the world slightly more habitable, in other words, by offering the following: form. Women experience the world as mystery. Kept ignorant of technology, economics, most of the practical skills required to function autonomously, kept ignorant of the real social and sexual demands made on women, deprived of physical strength, excluded from forums for the development of intellectual acuity and public self confidence, women are lost and mystified by the savage momentum of an ordinary life. Sounds, signs, promises, threats, wildly scissoring, but what do they mean? The right offers women a simple, fixed, predetermined social, biological, and sexual order. Form conquers chaos. Form banishes confusion. Form gives ignorance a shape, makes it look like something instead of nothing. Shelter. Women are brought up to maintain a husband's home and to believe that women without men are homeless. Women have a deep fear of being homeless, at the mercy of the elements and of strange men. The right claims to protect the home and the woman's place in it. Safety. For women, the world is a very dangerous place. One wrong move, even an unintentional smile, can bring disaster, assault, shame, disgrace. The right acknowledges the reality of danger, the validity of fear. The right then manipulates the fear. The promise is that if a woman is obedient, harm will not befall her. Rules. Living in a world she has not made and does not understand, a woman needs rules to know what to do next. If she knows what she is supposed to do, she can find a way to do it. If she learns the rules by rote, she can perform with apparent effortlessness, which will considerably enhance her chances for survival. The right, very considerately, tells women the rules of the game on which their lives depend. The right also promises that, despite their absolute sovereignty, men too will follow specified rules. Love. Love is always crucial in affecting the allegiance of women. The right offers women a concept of love based on order and stability, with formal areas of mutual accountability. A woman is loved for fulfilling her female functions. Obedience is an expression of love, and so are sexual submission and childbearing. In return, the man is supposed to be responsible for the material and emotional well being of the woman, and, increasingly, to redeem the cruel inadequacies of mortal men, The right offers women the love of Jesus, beautiful brother, tender lover, compassionate friend, perfect healer of sorrow and resentment, the one male to whom one can submit absolutely, be women, as it were, without being sexually violated or psychologically abused. It is important and fascinating, of course, to note that women never, no matter how deluded or needy or desperate, worship Jesus as the perfect son. No faith is that blind. There is no religious or cultural palliative to deaden the raw pain of the son's betrayal of the mother. Only her own obedience to the same Father, the sacrifice of her own life on the same cross, her own body nailed and bleeding, can enable her to accept that her son, like Jesus, has come to do his Father's work. Feminist Leah Fritz, in Thinking Like a Woman, described the excruciating predicament of women who try to find worth in Christian submission. Quote, unloved, unrespected, unnoticed by the Heavenly Father, condescended to by Son, and fucked by the Holy Ghost, Western woman spends her entire life, trying to please. End quote. But no matter how hard she tries to please, it is harder still for her to be pleased. In Bless This House, Anita Bryant describes how each day she must ask Jesus to, quote, help me love my husband and children, end quote. In The Total Woman, Maribel Morgan explains that it is only through God's powers that, quote, we can love and accept others, including our husbands, end quote. In The Gift of Inner Healing, Ruth Carter Stapleton counsels a young woman who is in a desperately unhappy marriage, quote, try to spend as little time each day visualizing Jesus coming in the door from work. Try to spend a little time each day visualizing Jesus coming in the door from work. Then see yourself walking up to him, embracing him. Say to Jesus, it's good to have you home, Nick. End quote. Ruth Carter Stapleton, married at 19, describing the early years of her marriage, she wrote, quote, after moving 450 miles from my first family in order to save my marriage, I found myself in a cold, threatening, unprotected world, or so it seemed to my confused heart. In an effort to avoid total destruction, I indulged in escapes of every kind. A major crisis arose when I discovered I was pregnant with my first child. I knew that this was supposed to be one of the crowning moments of womanhood, but not for me. When my baby was born, I wanted to be a good mother, but I felt even more trapped. Then 3 more babies were born in rapid succession, and each one, so beautiful, terrified me. I did love them, but by the 4th child, I was at the point of total desperation. End quote. Apparently, the birth of her 4th child occasioned her surrender to Jesus. For a time, life seemed worthwhile. Then, a rapture in a cherished friendship plummeted her into an intolerable depression. During this period, she jumped out of a moving car in what she regards as a suicide attempt. A male religious mentor picked up the pieces. Stapleton took her own experience of breakdown and recovery, and from it shaped a kind of faith psychotherapy. Nick's transformation into Jesus had already been mentioned. A male homosexual, traumatized by an absent father who never played with him as a child, played baseball with Jesus under Stapleton's tutelage. A whole 9 innings. In finding Jesus as father and chum, he was healed of the hurt of an absent father and quote unquote cured of his homosexuality. A woman who was forcibly raped by her father as a child was encouraged to remember the event. Only this time, Jesus had his hand on her father's shoulder and was forgiving him. This enabled the woman to forgive her father too, and to reconcile with men. A woman who as a child was rejected by her father on the occasion of her first date, the father did not notice her pretty dress, was encouraged to imagine the presence of Jesus on that fateful night. Jesus loved her dress and found her very desirable. Stapleton claims that this devotional therapy, through the power of the Holy Spirit, enables Jesus to erase damaging memories. A secular analysis of Stapleton's own newfound well being seems, by contrast, pedestrian. A brilliant woman has found a socially acceptable way to use her intellect and compassion in the public domain, the dream of many women. Through fundamentalist male ministers, sorry, Though fundamentalist male ministers have called her a witch in typical female fashion, Stapleton disclaims responsibility for her own inventiveness and credits the Holy Spirit, clearly male, thus soothing the savage misogyny of those who cannot bear any woman to be both seen and heard. Also, having founded an evangelical ministry that demands constant travel, Stapleton is rarely at home. She has not given birth again. Maribel Morgan's description of her own miserable marriage in the years preceding her discovery of God's will is best summarized in this one sentence, quote, "I was helpless and unhappy." End quote. She describes years of tension, conflict, boredom, and gloom. She took her fate into her own hands by asking the not yet classic question, what do men want? Her answer is stunningly accurate. Quote, "It is only when a woman surrenders her life to her husband, reveres and worships him, and is willing to serve him, that she becomes really beautiful to him." End quote. Or, more aphoristically, quote, "A total woman caters to her men's special quirks, whether it be in salads, sex, or sports." End quote. Citing God as the authority and submission to Jesus as the model, Morgan defines love as, quote, "unconditional acceptance of a man and his feelings." End quote. Morgan's achievement in The Total Woman was to isolate the basic sexual scenarios of male dominance and female submission, and to formulate a simple set of lessons, a pedagogy, that teaches women how to act out those scenarios within the context of Christian values. In other words, how to cater to male pornographic fantasies in the name of Jesus Christ. As Morgan explains in her own extraordinary prose style, quote, "That grace source book, the Bible, states, 'Marriage is honorable in all, and the bed is undefiled.' In other words, sex is for the marriage relationship only, but within those bounds, anything goes. Sex is as clean as is pure as eating cottage cheese." End quote. Morgan's detailed instructions on how to eat cottage cheese, the most famous of which involves saran wrap, makes clear that female submission is delicately balanced, comingly of resourcefulness and lack of self-respect. Too little resourcefulness or too much self-respect will doom a woman to failure as a total woman. A submissive nature is the miracle for which religious women pray. No one has prayed harder, longer, and with less apparent success than Anita Bryant. She has spent a good part of her life on her knees begging Jesus to forgive her for the sin of existing. In Mine Eyes Have Seen Glory, an autobiography first published in 1970, Bryant describes herself as an aggressive, stubborn, bad-tempered child. Her early childhood was spent in brutal poverty. Through singing, she began earning money when she was still a child. When she was very young, her parents divorced, then later remarried. When she was 13, her father abandoned her mother, younger sister, and herself. Her parents were again divorced, and shortly thereafter, her father remained remarried. At 13, quote, "What stands out most of all is in my memory, are my feelings of intense ambition and a relentless drive to succeed at doing well the things I loved, singing." End quote. She blamed herself, especially her driving ambition, for the loss of her father. She did not want to marry. In particular, she did not want to marry Bob Greene. He, quote unquote, won her through a war of attrition. Every quote unquote no on her part was taken as a quote unquote yes by him. When, on several occasions, she told him that she did not want to see him again, he simply ignored what she said. Once, when she was making a trip to see a close male friend whom she described to Greene as her fiancé, he booked passage on the same plane and went along. He hounded her. Having got his hooks into her, especially knowing how to hit on her rawest nerve, guilt over the abnormality of her ambition, by definition unwomanly and potentially satanic, Green manipulated Bryant with a cruelty nearly unmatched in modern love stories. From both Bryant's early books, a picture emerges. One sees a woman hemmed in, desperately trying to please a husband who manipulates and harasses her, and whose control of her life on every level is virtually absolute. Bryant describes the degree of Green's control in Mine Eyes. Quote, "That's how good a manager my husband is. He willingly handles all the business in my life, even to including the Lord's business. Despite our sometimes violent scraps, I love him for it." End quote. Bryant never specifies how violent the violent scraps were, though Green insists they were not violent. Green himself, in Bless This House, is very proud of spanking the children, especially the oldest son who is adopted. Quote, "I'm a father to my children, not a pal. I assert my authority. I spank them at times, and they respect me for it. Sometimes I take Bobby into the music room, and it's not as I can play him a piece on the piano. We play a piece on the seat of his pants." End quote. Some degree of physical violence, then, was admittedly an acceptable part of domestic life. Bryant's unself-conscious narrative makes clear that over a period of years, long before her anti-homosexual crusade was a glint in Bob Green's eye, she was badgered into giving public religious testimonies that deeply distressed her. Quote, "Bob has a way of getting my dander up and backing me against a wall. He gets me so terrifically mad at him that I hate him for pushing me into a corner. He did that now. Quote, 'You're a hypocrite,' end quote," Bob said. Quote, "You profess to have Christ in your life, but you won't profess him in public, which Christ tells you to do," end quote. "Because I know he's right, and I hate him for making me feel so bad about it, I end up doing what I'm scared to do." End quote. Conforming to the will of her husband was clearly a difficult struggle for Bryant. She writes candidly of her constant rebellion. Green's demands, from increasing her public presence as religious witness to doing all of the child care for 4 children without help while pursuing her career, the career she genuinely loves, were endurable only because Bryant, like Stapleton and Morgan, took Jesus as her real husband. Quote, "Only as I practice yielding to Jesus can I learn to submit, as the Bible instructs me, to the loving leadership of my husband. Only the power of Christ can enable a woman like me to become submissive in the Lord." End quote. Quote. In Bryant's case, the quote-unquote loving leadership of her husband, this time in league with her pastor, enshrines her as the token spokeswoman of anti-homosexual bigotry. Once again, Bryant was reluctant to testify, this time before Dade County's Metropolitan Commission, in hearings on homosexual rights ordinances. Bryant spent several nights in tears and prayer, presumably because, as she told Newsweek, quote, "I was scared and I didn't want to do it." End quote. Once again, a desire to do Christ's will brought her into conformity with the expressed will of her husband. One could speculate that some of the compensation in this conformity came from having the burdens of domestic work and childcare lessened in the interest of serving the greater cause. Conformity to the will of Christ, and Green, synonymous in this instance as so often before, also offered an answer to the haunting question of her life: how to be a public leader of significance, in her terminology, a star, and at the same time an obedient wife acting to protect her children. A singing career, especially a secular one, could never resolve this raging conflict. Bryant, like all the rest of us, is trying to be a quote unquote good woman. Bryant, like all the rest of us, is desperate and dangerous to herself and to others because quote unquote good women live and die in silent selflessness, and real women cannot. Bryant, like the rest of us, is having one hell of a hard time. Note: this analysis of Bryant's situation was written in 1978 and published in Miss in June 1979. In May 1980, Bryant filed for divorce. In a statement issued separately from the divorce petition, she contended that Green had, quote, violated my most precious asset, my conscience, end quote. New York Times, May 24th, 1980. Within 3 weeks after the divorce decree, August 1980, the state citrus agency of Florida, which Bryant had represented for 11 years, decided she was no longer a suitable representative because of her divorce. Quote, the contract had to expire because the divorce and so forth, end quote, one agency executive said. New York Times, September 2nd, 1980. Feminist lawyer and former National Organization of Women president Karen DeCrow urged Bryant to bring suit under the 1977 Florida Human Rights Act, which prohibited job discrimination on the basis of marital status. Even before DeCrow's sisterly act, however, Bryant had re-evaluated her position on the women movement, to which, under Green's tutelage, she had been bitterly opposed. Quote, what has happened to me, end quote, Bryant told National Enquirer in June 1980, quote, makes me understand why they are angry women who never want to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. This still is not the answer, but the church doesn't deal with the problems of women as it should. There's been some really bad teachings, and I think that's why I'm really concerned for my own children, particularly the girls. You have to recognize that there has been discrimination against women, that women have not had the teaching of the fullness and uniqueness of their abilities, end quote. Pace, sister. Phyllis Schlafly, the right's not born again philosopher of the absurd, is apparently not having a hard time. She seems possessed by Machiavelli, not Jesus. It appears that she wants to be the prince. She might be viewed as the rare woman of any ideological persuasion who rarely does see herself as one of the boys, even as she claims to be one of the girls. Unlike most other right-wing women, Schlafly, in her written and spoken work, does not acknowledge experiencing any of the difficulties that tear women apart. In the opinion of many, her ruthlessness as an organizer is best demonstrated in her demagogic propaganda against the Equal Rights Amendment, though she also waxes eloquent against the reproductive freedom, the women's movement, big government, and the Panama Canal Treaty. Her roots, and perhaps her heart, such as it is, are in the old right, but she remained unknown to any significant public until she mounted her crusade against the Equal Rights Amendment. It is likely that her ambition is to use women as a constituency to effect entry into the upper echelon of right-wing male leadership. She may yet discover that she is a woman, as feminists understand the meaning of the word, as her male colleagues refuse to let her escape the ghetto of female issues and enter the big time. Note: according to many newspaper reports, Phyllis Schlafly wanted Reagan to appoint her to a position in the Pentagon. This he did not do. In a debate with Schlafly, Stanford University, June 26, 1982, lawyer Catherine A. McKinnon tried to make Schlafly understand that she had been discriminated against as a woman. Quote, Mrs. Schlafly tells us that being a woman has not gotten in her way. I propose that any man who had a law degree and graduate work in political science, had given testimony on a wide range of important subjects for decades, and had done effective and brilliant political, policy, and organizational work within the party, the Republican Party, had published widely, including 9 books, and stopped a major social initiative to amend the Constitution just short of victory, dead in its tracks, the Equal Rights Amendment, and had a beautiful, accomplished family. Any man like that would have a place in the current administration. I would accept correction if this is wrong, and she may yet be appointed. She was widely reported to have wanted such a post, but I don't believe everything I read, especially about women. I do think she should have wanted 1. and they would have found her a place she wanted. She certainly deserved a place in the Defense Department. Phyllis Schlafly is a qualified woman. End quote. Answered Schlafly, quote, "This has been an interesting debate, more interesting than I thought it was going to be. I think my opponent did have one good point." Audience laughter. Well, she had a couple of good points. She did have a good point about the Reagan administration, but it is the Reagan administration's loss that they didn't ask me to drown out by audience applause. But it isn't my loss. End quote. At any rate, she seems to be able to manipulate the fears of women without experiencing them. If this is indeed the case, this talent would give her an invaluable, cold blooded detachment as a strategist determined to convert women into anti feminist activists. It is precisely because women have been trained to respect and follow those who use them that Schlafly inspires awe and devotion in many women who are afraid that they will be deprived of the form, shelter, safety, rules, and love that the right promises and on which they believe survival depends. At the National Women's Conference, Houston, Texas, November 1977, I spoke with many women on the right. The conversations were ludicrous, terrifying, bizarre, instructive, and as other feminists have reported, sometimes strangely moving. Right wing women fear lesbians. A liberal black delegate from Texas told me that local white women had tried to convince her that lesbians at the conference would assault her, call her dirty names, and were personally filthy. She told me that she would vote against sexual preference resolution. Note: Congress, state, and the local legislature should enact legislation to eliminate, note, quote, Congress, state, and local legislatures should enact legislation to eliminate discrimination on the basis of sexual and affectional preference in areas including, but not limited to, employment, housing, public accommodations, credit, public facilities, government funding, and the military. State legislatures should reform their penal codes or repeal state laws that restrict private sexual behaviors between consenting adults. State legislatures should enact legislation that would prohibit consideration of sexual or affectional orientation as a factor in any judicial determination of child custody or visitation rights. Rather, child custody cases should be evaluated solely on the merits of which party is the better parent, without regard to that person's sexual and affectional orientation. She told me that she would vote against the sexual preference resolution because otherwise she would not be able to return home. But she also said that she would tell the white women that lesbians had been polite and clean. She said that she knew it was wrong to deprive anyone of a job and had had no idea before coming to Houston that lesbian mothers lost their children. This, she felt, was genuinely terrible. I asked her if she thought a time would come when she would have to stand up for lesbian rights in her hometown. She nodded yes gravely, then explained, with careful, evocative emphasis, that the next closest town to where she lived was 160 miles away. This history of blacks in the South was palpable. Right-wing women consistently spoke to me about lesbians as if lesbians were rapists, certified committers of sexual assault against women and girls. No facts could intrude on this psychosexual fantasy. No facts or figures on male sexual violence against women and children could change the focus of their fear. They admitted they knew many cases of male assault against females, including within families, and did not know any assaults by lesbians against females. The men, they acknowledged when pressed, were sinners, and they hated sin. But there was clearly something comforting in the normalcy of heterosexual rape. To them, the lesbian was inherently monstrous, experienced almost as a demonic sexual force hovering closer and closer. She was the dangerous intruder, encroaching, threatening by her very presence a sexual order that cannot bear scrutiny or withstand challenge. Right wing women regard abortion as the callous murder of infants. Female selflessness expresses itself in the conviction that a fertilized egg surpasses an adult human in the authority of its existence. Sorry, in the authenticity of its existence. The grief of those women for fetuses is real, and their contempt for women who become pregnant out of wedlock is awesome to behold. The fact that most illegal abortions in the bad old days were performed on married women with children, and that the thousands of those women died each year, is utterly meaningless to them. They see abortion as a criminal act committed by godless whores, women absolutely unlike themselves. Right wing women argue that passage of the Equal Rights Amendment will legalize abortion irrevocably. No matter how often I heard this argument, and I heard it constantly, I simply could not understand it. Fool that I was, I had thought the Equal Rights Amendment was abhorrent because of toilets. Since toilets figured prominently in the resistance to civil rights legislation that would protect blacks, the argument that centered on toilets, while irrational, was as American as apple pie. No one mentioned toilets. I brought them up, but no one cared to discuss them. The passionate, repeated cause and effect argument linking the Equal Rights Amendment and abortion presented a new mystery. I resigned myself to hopeless confusion. Happily, after the conference, I read The Power of the Positive Woman, in which Schlafly explains, quote, since the mandate of ERA is for sex equality, abortion is essential to relieve women of their unequal burden of being forced to bear an unwanted baby. End quote. Forcing women to bear unwanted babies is crucial to the social program of women who have been forced to bear unwanted babies and who cannot bear the grief and bitterness of such a recognition. The Equal Rights Amendment has now become the symbol of this devastating recognition. This largely accounts for the new wave of intransigent opposition to it. Right wing women, as presented in Houston, especially from the South, white and black, also do not like Jews. They live in a Christian country. A fragile but growing coalition between white and black women in the New South is based on a shared Christian fundamentalism, which translates into a shared anti Semitism. The stubborn refusal of Jews to embrace Christ and the barely masked fundamentalist perception of Jews as Christ killers, communists, and usurers of and usurers both, queers, and worst of all, urban intellectuals, mark Jews as foreign, sinister, and an obvious source of the many satanic conspiracies sweeping the nation. The most insidious expression of this rife anti Semitism was conveyed by a fixed stare, a self conscious smile, and the delightful words, quote, ah, just love that Jewish people, end quote. The slime variety of anti Semite, very much in evidence, was typified by a right to life leader who called doctors to perform abortions, quote, Jewish baby killers, end quote. I was asked 100 times, quote, Am I speaking with a Jewish girl? End quote. Despite my clear presence as a lesbian feminist with press credentials plastered all over me from the notorious Miss magazine, it was as a Jew that I was constantly challenged and, on several occasions, implicitly threatened. Conversation after conversation stopped abruptly when I answered that yes, I was a Jew. The right in the United States, today, is a social and political movement controlled almost totally by men, but built largely on the fear and ignorance of women. The quality of this fear, and the pervasiveness of this ignorance are consequences of male sexual domination over women. Every accommodation that women make to this domination, however apparently stupid, self defeating, or dangerous, is rooted in the urgent need to survive somehow on male terms. Inevitably, this causes women to take the rage and contempt they feel for the men who actually abuse them, those close to them, and project it onto others, those far away, foreign, or different. Some women do this by becoming right wing patriots, nationalists, determined to triumph over populations thousands of miles removed. Some women become ardent racists, anti Semites, or homophobes. Some women develop a hatred of loose or destitute women, pregnant teenage girls, all persons unemployed or on welfare. Some hate individuals who violate social conventions, no matter how superficial the violation. Some become antagonistic to other ethnic groups other than their own, or to religious groups other than their own, or they develop a hatred of those political convictions that contradict their own. Women cling to irrational hatreds, focus particularly on the unfamiliar, so that they will not murder their fathers, husbands, sons, brothers, lovers, the men with whom they are intimate, those who do hurt them and cause them grief. Fear of a greater evil and a need to be protected from its intensify the loyalty of women to men who are, even when dangerous, at least known quantities. Because women so displace their rage, they are easily controlled and manipulated haters. Having good reason to hate, but not the courage to rebel, women require symbols of danger that justify their fear. The right provides these symbols of danger by designated, clearly defined groups of outsiders as sources of danger. The identities of the dangerous outsiders can change over time to meet changing social circumstances. For example, racism can be encouraged or contained, anti Semitism can be provoked or kept dormant, homophobia can be aggravated or kept under the surface. But the existence of the dangerous outsider always functions for women simultaneously as deception, diversion, painkiller, and threat. The tragedy is that women, so committed to survival, cannot recognize that they are committing suicide. The danger is that self sacrificing women are perfect foot soldiers who obey orders, no matter how criminal those orders are. The hope is that these women, upset by internal conflicts that cannot be stilled by manipulation, challenged by clarifying drama of public confrontation and dialogue, will be forced to articulate the realities of their own experiences as women subject to the will of men. In doing so, the anger that necessarily arises from a true perception of how they have been debased may move them beyond the fear that transfixes them to a meaningful rebellion against the men who, in fact, diminish, despise, and terrorize them. This is the common struggle of all women, whatever their male defined ideological origins. And this struggle alone has the power to transform women who are enemies against one another into allies fighting for individual and collective survival that is not based on self loathing, fear, and humiliation, but instead on self determination, dignity, and authentic integrity.